All right, good morning. Welcome to this live webinar, and thank you all for joining today. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rohit Sethi. I'm the CEO at Security Compass. My area of expertise since the beginning of my career is helping organizations build security into software and accelerate time to market. So I've been with the company for 14 years, believe it or not, and feel very lucky to work with this group of people. So just a little bit about Security Compass before we launch into the webinar. We're a leader in helping customers proactively manage cybersecurity risk without slowing down business. And we do this with three key offerings: the SD Elements platform, which is a balanced development automation solution. Talk about that for a minute after this. Our training products to help people build software into security and teach them how. And then our advisory practice, which includes services like penetration testing, red teaming, and cloud security. Emerging technologies is an area of expertise. So about balanced development automation. What we believe is a core challenge in the industry today is that organizations need to focus on rapid software development, but they need to bake in best practices from a security standpoint. And so balanced development automation solutions are a category of products that help to achieve both of these goals. Now, we have what's called the developer's dilemma, which is one approach to achieving this goal is build software, rely on a set of reactive processes such as like static analysis, penetration testing, and other after the code has been written controls, and then choose to ship software or not. And you can really build things quickly that way by just reacting to issues that come up and perhaps ignoring them. But you do so at the expense of not following a set of industry standard best practices like threat modeling, risk assessments, secure coding standards, developer training. The other approach, which we often see in heavily regulated markets, for example, in banks, is what we call the slow and safe approach, which is to embed all of these proactive processes, but do so in a way that requires human expertise, right? And so you slow down the development process, you sacrifice some of that time to market, but you have a more robust product. And so we call this a developer's dilemma because nobody really wants to be fast and risky or slow and safe. And so this is really what balanced development automation helps to achieve, which is accelerate time to market for secure software, save operational remediation costs, and strengthen product security. So that's a little bit about the category. And so balanced development automation is a third option that helps people be both fast and safe. So I'd like to mention a couple things from a housekeeping perspective. Your lines are muted upon sign in to the webinar. And if we run out of time and there are still any outstanding questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We'll follow up with you after the webinar. And everybody who's registered for this webinar will get a link to the recording. So thank you for that. And so one quick question. The agenda. So we're going to talk about some key market challenges and trends that impact security, risk, and application development. We're going to then move into our panel discussion, and then we're going to move on to Q&A. So before we get started on that, quick poll. You're going to have a polling come up in front of you. If you can answer this question, what are the top corporate technology investment priorities in the next 5 years for your company? Yeah, looks like we got representation of everything here. Give it a few more seconds. All right, so there's the results. Cloud migration, operational security automation, cybersecurity and privacy resilience, and zero trust and going digital. Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing that. So let's move on to our next section here. So I'd like to introduce Sandy Carielli. She is the principal analyst at Forrester, and her expertise is in application security, including things like proactive security design, security testing and software, protection of applications in production, and remediation. And she's obviously got a wealth of experience here in a number of relevant areas. So we're really pleased to have Sandy join us. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Rohit. Thank you for having me. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone from wherever you may be joining from. Great to be here today. And Rohit, I think you have laid the foundation really well, because we're going to be talking about security at the speed of development. And you mentioned that challenge and that need. Organizations want to get product to market. Their goal is to get product in customers' hands. And what we're seeing is that development teams are incented to deliver quickly. They want to get product to their customer, and a lot of their goals, a lot of their priorities are tied to this particular need. So Forrester has asked senior developers, those at manager level or higher, what are your team's top priorities over the next 12 months? And you can see a lot of these are tied to speed, whether that's increasing automation of secure software delivery lifecycle tasks, whether that's speeding up release cycle time more broadly, whether that's using more open source. A lot of these are tied to how can we move faster, how can we get product to market? And remember, development teams are incented on getting product out the door. They're not incented on security. So we sort of need to operate with that goal that we want to help enable organizations to move quickly. That's the first thing. Second thing is that this is happening even faster. Over the past few years, we have been asking developers, how quickly are you getting product out there? How fast are you releasing? In 2018, 27% of them said they were releasing monthly or more frequently. A year later, in 2019, that number jumped to 38%. This year, it jumped again to 41%. So not only are they moving faster, they're accelerating. They're continuing to move faster and faster. Again, goal is to get product out the door. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is what's evolved over the last few months, where even organizations that were more brick and mortar suddenly had to pivot very quickly to more of a digital experience and turn around new applications quickly in order to serve their customers. That said, what's the other side of that? We talk about speed and security. Applications are still the most common way in for attackers. 33% of firms suffered a breach as a result of some sort of external attack, but applications were the most common way in that case. We asked organizations, how did attackers get in? And you can see that the number 1 and number 2 responses here were software vulnerabilities and web application flaws. And those have been number 1 and number 2 pretty consistently for the past couple of years. Sometimes it's been flipped around. Sometimes it has been web applications at number 1, software vulnerabilities at number 2. But those have consistently been the top 2. And take a look at number 3, use of stolen credentials. There's a pretty big gap between number 2 and number 3. So it's not just that applications are the most common way in. They are far and away the most common way in. Now here's the challenge. As much as we want to be able to move fast and get product out the door, it's a heck of a lot harder to fix something after it's been released, to go back and take a look and untangle the web of decisions that have been made. We've seen, however, a lot of really interesting applications that have been put out in the last several months. And here's where I'm actually going to step back for a second and ask Rohit, what's something you have done digitally for the first time in the past few months that maybe you have never done before?
Yeah, so kind of speaking to what we see on the screen, I signed up in Canada here for our national COVID tracing app. So that was a unique experience. Yeah. It's something I didn't, ever thought of before this year.
Yeah, those apps didn't even exist 6 months ago, but there was a need to develop them and get them out there very quickly to solve a very specific, urgent problem. In my case, the thing that I did for the first time digitally is I signed up for grocery delivery. I had always just gone to the grocery store and done my own shopping, but I went online and I signed up for the local supermarket to do my shopping for me and bring it to me. And a lot of those organizations, even if they had online grocery delivery and order beforehand, they suddenly found themselves subject to huge demand and had to scale up tremendously. So there was this need to adjust to either update your applications, make them more scalable, roll out new applications, and turn that around very quickly to meet a sudden and urgent customer need, consumer need, patient need, citizen need, whatever it was. But again, if security isn't attended to at the beginning, it's a lot harder to fix it at the end. And what we have here is an example. India rolled out their COVID-19 contact tracing app, but there were some pretty significant weaknesses in it, where somebody on the other side of the world was actually able to see the COVID status of a household, much more information than they should have access to, because some of the permissions and the APIs and the data validation wasn't in place. And that's what can happen if you're not paying attention at the beginning. So what are we seeing as challenges? Well, regulatory is still way up there. You ask security decision makers about some of the security challenges for their organization, 25% of them cite responding to all those new cybersecurity regulations. And there have been a host of them that have cropped up over the past few years that need to be responded to. There are also a bunch of challenges with respect to how do you manage those regulations in current times as regulations are evolving, as needs are evolving. How do we make sure that we are meeting customer needs, we're getting product out the door, and by the way, we're also staying in compliance? A whole bunch of different issues to pay attention to here. So what are the approaches that organizations are taking? And here's where I'm going to try and stay out of acronym land too much. But there's a lot of tooling that organizations are putting in place in order to help accelerate security within development. And the idea here is to build security into the software development lifecycle so that it's not an add-on at the end, so there's not this temptation to fix it in post, but so that you are able to assess security more organically throughout the product lifecycle. We're going to start with software composition analysis, which is scanning for vulnerabilities in your open source code. I'm guessing a lot of you on the phone, a lot of you on the webinar today, you probably use open source. Your organizations probably use open source in some area of your development, because most people do, because again, it helps you get product out the door faster. Well, what we're seeing is that organizations are starting to move towards it more in the development and testing realms. You can see, 31% of respondents had already implemented SCA, software composition analysis in development. But the good news is 37% are planning to do so within the next 12 months. So there is an acceleration, there is a realization that we need to do more of this, and we need to do it earlier in the life cycle. Now let's talk about some other tools. Static application security testing. Where SCA, software composition analysis was around open source, static application security testing is tied to the code that your own developers are building. And again, we're running those scans, we're building it into the development lifecycle, ideally tying it in with your entire CI/CD tool chain so that you're adding automation, so that you're building it in, and it's not an add-on, it's more usable, and it's less frustrating to your developers. None of us like to get that call from security at the 11th hour saying, hey, we've just discovered a vulnerability and you need to deal with it now. The point of tooling is to address this sooner. You can see that SAST is another one where there's a lot of focus on testing. 37% have implemented it in the test phase, with another 42% planning. 35% are planning to implement in development, and 18% are even planning to implement it in design. This is good as far as it goes, but it really does need to shift even earlier. There needs to be a continued shift more towards development design so that, again, you identify issues faster, you're able to remediate them faster before you have to string through loads of code and figure out what the implication is of making those fixes. Finally, let's talk about one other approach. Interactive application security testing, really built in with your functional testing so that you're identifying security issues at the same time you're identifying functional issues. Again, what you're seeing, This is moving to earlier in the development phase. These are all good signs. It's good that organizations are trying to get this out there and trying to build this into the life cycle, not wait until the end. This is the scanning aspect of it, though. And Rohit, I know we've talked about scanning here, but there are other approaches as well. When I talk to customers as they're planning to move to more of a DevSecOps standpoint and mindset, they often ask me about tooling. They'll often ask me more broadly about process. And there's a lot to those questions. What are some of your thoughts on what about things that can't be scanned?
Yeah, really good question, Sandy. I think it's something that we see a lot from our customer base. And I think scanning has definitely become industry standard best practice, which is great. I remember starting out in this field and nobody did anything like this. And,
Right.
Some people did pen testing sometimes, but mostly, it was mostly after incident response that anybody really got, involved in security. So it's good to see that dynamic has shifted. But I think, we see challenges. So, there's lots of examples of things where, at least, today, like thinking about a scanner to find certain kinds of security and compliance issues doesn't really work. So, really basic example would be, say, in the realm of privacy, when you want to know, whether you should be asking for consent to collect personal information. That's really a high-level requirement, not the kind of thing that a code scanner is going to find. But even things like, do you have authentication? I mean, if you think about it, it's really interesting, right? Scanner won't find an issue there. But then you can really double click into things like, authorization challenges, really sort of across the spectrum. There are certain things that, it's not really the forte of a scanner to find, although they're really good at finding certain things. And so this is the reason why we have concepts like threat modeling, secure coding standards, security requirements. But I think what we often find is that because they are largely manual, at least how they're usually done, people tend to not want to do them, and so they focus more on having multiple scanners and sort of downstream mitigating controls, like monitoring, for example, and having tight incident response. But unfortunately, that doesn't always work out. You kind of leave a very basic vulnerability in, say, hard-coded credentials or default credentials in a product that you ship, right? And very basic control, but just because it wasn't caught in this scan doesn't mean there's not going to be some impact down the road.
It's funny you mentioned that. I certainly remember the days where pen tests were really the only option that you had, in the pre-scanning world. And, to your point, the more you can do early on and the more you can ask the right questions about, what are your privacy requirements and, what you have to be in compliance with and what are all of the other risks that you need to be aware of, that's really critical. And asking them early and asking them often. So yes, the more you scan, the faster the fix time. That is something that we found. Security flaws are going to persist a lot longer in organizations that scan less frequently versus more frequently. 3.5 times longer if you scan less than 3 times a year versus 7 to 12 times a year. But then 11.5 times longer for those that scan 3 times a year versus 300 times a year, which is pretty much every day. So that speaks to the scanning need and the frequency there. And then you put on top of that the early definition of your privacy requirements, of your data requirements, of all of those elements. You put those together and you start to have more of a holistic program. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of automation in there, because the key element in all this you talked about, Rohit, nobody likes doing the manual stuff. Manual is hard. Manual means I have to take time. Manual means we need people, all these things that nobody necessarily loves to do. And that's where automation has really come to the fore. And it's come to the fore in all sorts of ways. We talk about automation from the standpoint first of feedback cycles. If you have automated tools and automations within your security infrastructure, you're able to reduce the feedback time from weeks and days, maybe to hours or minutes. And if I am a developer or if I'm an architect, it makes a huge difference for me to get that more instant feedback of either you haven't thought about this issue or there was a flaw in the code you wrote. Because the difference is You know, if I get information about something that I wrote a month ago, what are the chances that I actually remember what it is I wrote? The first thing that I have to do is now open up the file, go back through, oh, okay, that's what I wrote. I had to remind myself how it worked. I had to spend all this time. I haven't thought about it. There's a huge relearning curve there. Whereas if we use automation to reduce that feedback loop to minutes or hours, my head's still in the game. I still remember what I was thinking when I wrote this. I still remember what decisions I was making. I still remember perhaps this conversation I had with the security architect last week about privacy requirements. So it's much fresher in my mind. And that's going to allow me to resolve issues much more quickly. And development managers agree. Increasing automation is one of their top 3 priorities for the coming year for 29% of respondents. So there is definitely this push to get more automation into the software development lifecycle because it's going to allow them to resolve these issues more quickly, going to allow them to shorten the feedback loops, going to allow them to get more product out the door. Remember, their goal is to make the customers happy, get product that customers are going to use out there. So what does it mean to build security automation throughout the software development lifecycle, and what's the value of doing that? And in particular, not just doing it during tests, not just doing it before deployment, doing it during development, doing it even during design. First of all, you're going to have fewer security flaws. We already talked about the fact that the more you scan, the more you test, the more you ask the questions, the less time that flaws are going to persist within your product, within your code. So if you're building that in, that means that you're going to be running all of this work, doing these assessments, doing these scans, doing these evaluations much more frequently, much more fluidly, without a lot of bottlenecks in the process. Fewer flaws, fantastic. Now, what about scaling your dev team? This is a pretty critical element of this, because if you're able to have your dev team spending less time on fixing stuff, less time on manual handoffs, less time on walking next door, or perhaps virtually next door nowadays to talk to the person about the issue that just came up, that means they're spending more time on the thing that's important to them, the thing we talked about at the beginning of this webinar, getting product in customers' hands, which remember is what they're incented on, what many of you on the phone are incented on. You want to get product to market. So if we're building automation in, the dev team's able to scale out more, pay attention to much higher order issues, and not deal with the little stuff. The other value that I don't think we talk enough about with respect to security automation is that real-time education element. Remember what I said about feedback loops, that I would have the ability then to make the fix while I was still thinking about the code. If I am notified of issues that I have introduced, of flaws that I've added to the code, of mistakes that I've made, while I'm still building, while I'm still in the mindset, while I'm still building that part of the product, eventually over time, maybe there's a chance I'll learn not to do it. So yeah, most organizations, and you probably have various secure development training classes and external sessions that your developers and that your team has to do, and they go through and they take a test and they get the little checkbox and everyone has to do it. That's good and, certainly part of it, but there's no substituting for that real-time education, that real-time feedback loop where you learn as you're doing. That's always the best way to learn through doing. So if automation allows me to quickly see where I've messed up, provides guidance on how to fix it, that's going to not only help me build a better product, but it means the next time maybe I won't introduce that because I will have learned from that. So to all that point, we've talked about the fact that organizations are building out more and more applications today, and they've had to because they need to serve the needs of their customers. So there's a tremendous amount of turmoil that we've all experienced over the last 6 months, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of security transformation. And let's talk a little bit about that because there are some trends that we want to pay attention to here. First of all, the reality is, you've probably seen, if you haven't experienced it yourself, maybe some of your friends have, some sort of budget cuts. Maybe you have a hiring freeze. Maybe you have friends that are looking for work. Maybe you have reductions in hours. Maybe your hope to bring on a new team to deal with this issue has been slashed. That's going to add importance to security automation because if you're able to invest more in that security automation, then you can use the team that you do have for the higher order, more important things. So we're definitely seeing that as organizations have to be a little bit more efficient, they're going to look at how their various tools are connected and how they can integrate in order to better automate their entire software development lifecycle. And by the way, the rest of their organizational infrastructure as well. The more they can automate, then the more their team can scale out and focus on other important initiatives. Related to that is integration with the CI/CD pipeline. Many of us were probably working in an office before COVID-19 hit. Not all of us. Some of us may very well have been used to more of a remote lifestyle and working with organizations across a huge geographical gap. But many of us were in person. And when you're in person, it's really easy to, or easier to resolve issues that crop up. You can walk next door to the CISO's office and say, hey, we've got a problem here. Can you help me talk through it? Or you have that random conversation that happens to occur at the water cooler and you resolve something. Or you go next door and you have a face-to-face talk in order to get sign-off to advance to the next stage. As everyone has had to go remote, that leadership charisma that was so important in the office sometimes gets lost. So the integrations and the automation become much more critical because it's helping to mitigate some of those process gaps that perhaps you were able to gloss over beforehand. Now we don't have the chance. Now we can't gloss over them. Now we actually have to fix them. Now we have to bring all of the people to the table and say, what are the tools we need to put in place? What are the automations that need to occur in order for us to still move quickly and not have these gaps and not have these blockers within the process? Final point I'll make is around general economic constraints and what that does to security innovation. We're going to see organizations, because they have to be creative, because they have to do more with it less, perhaps take the lead and try and come up with new innovative solutions. That's great, but that's going to be another area where you're going to want to ask the questions around what are the privacy implications? What are the risks? What pieces of data are we dealing with here? Is there anything in regulatory compliance that we need to make certain that we don't run afoul of? So those are all things that need to be kept in mind, even as we try to move quickly and make sure we automate and bring everything together. Now, we've talked at the moment a lot about scaling our tooling and using our tooling to scale out and be more efficient. But there's also an element here to scaling our people. I love to talk about developer security champions. This is something that I've been passionate about for quite a while, really even pre-COVID. Developer security champions are developers. They are on the development team, they're developers first. But they have been trained up in security principles, and they know the security team. And they are able to represent security to the dev team. They're able to raise issues. They're able to scale security's credibility down to dev, over to dev, and make sure that issues are being addressed. They're able to make sure that issues are being addressed where they're actually occurring, at the source, at development. You know, there's this sort of sense sometimes that security and development are on very opposite sides of the table, as you see here. You know, the concept of bringing, you know, an axe to a hockey game or a hockey stick to a forest to do lumberjack work, you know, bring in these very disparate tools. But the more that you are able to leverage developer security champions to interface and to help represent the points of view with each other, the easier that ends up becoming. So that suddenly the hockey player is able to, you know, understand and communicate with the lumberjack here about what's important. And by the same token, the developer knows, okay, this is an issue that is really critical, high level, I need to bring in security. But these other things, I'm aware of them, I've been trained, and I can help represent that and make sure that development does the right thing. So it's really about scaling and bringing credibility in both directions. So why do we have to do this? Why do we want to do this? Again, it's about bridging the gap and scaling the team. And if we scale the team, they're able to do more. They're able to focus on the high value work. And that's what this is all about. Automation, champions, integration, it's all about making sure that we are able to do the high value work and get product out the door. So if we're bringing this all together, what is it that I most want you to walk away with? One, we want to build security into the process from the beginning. You know, Rohit talked about that early on. We've talked about the need to build automation in early, make sure we're asking the right questions at the beginning, all of those things, and integrate the tooling into the developer workflow so that the developers aren't having to open up tools outside of their traditional workflow. They're not seeing this as a bottleneck. It's part of their process. It's built in. It's organic to what they're doing so that they're able to get product out the door using the tools, using the processes that they're used to, with a little bit added on top, but it's not stopping them. It's not slowing them down. We talk about investing in automation quite a bit, but I am going to give the caveat here. Automated junk is still junk. So as you're talking about automation, make sure you have the underlying foundation and solid processes that you can work off of so that you're actually automating things that matter. And finally, while we've talked about the tools, let's also remember the people. If we can extend security's reach through developer security champion programs and other types of programs, we're going to be able to add an additional level of scale and make sure that we are meeting development teams and the company's goal of getting product in customers' hands and meeting customers' needs, patients' needs, citizens' needs, whoever our customer base is, but that we're meeting their needs during this very critical time. Rohit, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you so much for that really insightful presentation, Sandy. And I like that automated junk is still junk. That's great.
Sad but true, right?
Yeah, no, sounds good. So we're gonna move on the agenda here. I know people have started to ask questions, and thank you. Please continue to ask questions. Before we do that, we're gonna do one more poll. We're gonna do our panel discussion, and then we'll come back to answer all the questions that have come up. So here's the first question: in this era of digital business, what are the top of mind concerns for you in balancing DevOps speed and business risk for your organization? So pick all the ones that apply. Give it 10 more seconds here. Okay. So here you are. Well, no surprise, I guess, in this audience. Cybersecurity is number one, risk management coming in below that, then system integration, talent shortage, and then other. So thanks for sharing that, everyone. All right. We're going to now move into the panel discussion portion of our agenda here. So we're privileged to have two experts join our panel. The first one, just progress on the slides here, is Andy Weisman. So Andy is a management consultant at Weisman Advisory, has a lot of broad expertise in IT strategy, has worked as a CIO at multiple companies before, and also in the Infotech Research Group as an analyst. So he's helping IT leaders develop and execute IT strategies, improve process, industry analysis, and has broad experience in industry. So welcome, Andy. Thank you. And we are again joined by Sandy, so she'll be participating in the panel as well. Thank you both. All right. So, sorry. So let's move on to the panel discussion questions. So first question, and this is for you, Andy. In your experience advising many IT leaders and as a CIO of 3 large organizations, what would you say are the most critical strategic elements of cybersecurity and cyber risk management that IT leaders need to consider in order for an enterprise to achieve its goals?
Hi, everybody. Let me kind of focus on 3 things. The first one is the engagement of all of the individuals who need to be part of the security discussion and the risk discussion. And a lot of IT leaders don't have the kind of connection with senior management and certainly the board of directors to be able to have a meaningful conversation. And what typically happens is there's an annual report at best, kind of looking back on security challenges, and I don't think that's enough. So you need to create that level of engagement first. The second thing is that you could spend a tremendous amount of money and energy addressing all perspectives on risk management and security, and you unless you're a company that I've never met, you have to focus on those things that are really important. So part of the strategic plan is really prioritizing those things that are important to your organization from a management perspective, and what you think the risks are from your perspective or your CISO's perspective. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that most organizations, if they have a security strategy at all, have tended to focus on prevention. And as we've seen from the statistics, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so the strategic plan needs to address not only prevention, but awareness or detection, and also have a plan for what do you do if it happens to you. And I think we have a number of examples of some very large retailers who have had security breaches who clearly don't have a plan as to who to communicate, how to deal with restoration of service, and so on. So those are the three things that I think are important in terms of putting together a security plan.
Great, thanks, Andy. Really appreciate that. Very insightful. Now, this one is for both of you, and I'm going to start with Sandy. How do you expect the adoption of the ultimate shift left approach, that is, right through to requirements and design before code is written, to change over time?
It's a great question, Rohit, and I want to answer it in two parts. One, I think we're going to continue to see more uptick of various tooling at the design and development layer, but I also think we need to think about how development and how coding and who developers even are is going to change. You know, we're used to thinking about developers as these professional developers in your organization who have been trained up in C or Java or Python or whatever, and they're still playing a role. But as low code becomes more important as well, as that takes off, suddenly you have this whole suite of other developers, citizen developers, who you probably, as a security professional, you've never had to talk to about security before. They haven't been through your developer trainings. You know, if your developers didn't have awareness of certain security principles, your citizen developers certainly didn't. So there's this whole element of needing to extend reach and extend security's reach more broadly to other constituencies. And by the way, not just citizen developers, but also as you start to put out APIs. And now suddenly you have people from outside your organization, partners and, you know, and customers and interested parties creating applications with your APIs. That's another constituency that you don't have control over. So all of that speaks to needing to have more guardrails and expand your communications network, because it's not just about dev anymore.
Yeah, great question, Sandy. And Andy, I'm going to pose the same question to you.
Well, I just want to build on what Sandy said. I've observed over the last number of years a reduction for most companies, not the big ones, but the medium and smaller ones, a reduction in internal development and a greater focus on either purchase of software that you run within your own operation, or more increasingly the use of cloud providers to obtain software. And one of the fastest ways to add functionality to your portfolio is to buy it ready-made as opposed to build it. And so if you're looking at this as a CIO and you're looking at this from a risk management or security perspective, recognize the fact that that just fixing the development challenge that Sandy talked about doesn't cover the waterfront. And it may be important for you if you're a big player and you do a lot of custom development, but the typical CIO is dealing with an organization with an increasing dependence on external developers. And that represents a totally different security challenge than what we've been talking about in terms of internal development.
Rohit, if I may on that, because I think Andy raised a great point. We talked a little bit earlier about open source, and that's another area through which organizations are adding functionality quickly. Yeah. Well, what I would say to any CIO is, don't be scared of open source. It's critical to your business, and yet you're going to have to make sure that you're evaluating that and addressing the potential security requirements at the same time. So it is an absolute necessity, and yet you also need to make sure you're paying attention.
Great point, Sandy. So very good insight. And Andy, I'm gonna leave you with one more question here. In today's context of a large remote workforce, what new cybersecurity issues have emerged around the use of business software?
Well, first of all, if an organization already has a well-developed policy in terms of remote users or bring your own computer, then it becomes more of a question of scaling. Can you, in fact, implement that policy when, in fact, overnight you've had to add to your army of remote users? So the first thing is, do you have a policy? And if you have a policy, then try to figure out how to apply it on a broader scale. But if you don't have a policy, or you can't scale that policy, then you have an increased risk. So I'll give you an example. In a lot of organizations, the organization issues a laptop to the appropriate individuals and closely controls the applications that are being run on it. If you've now doubled or tripled or quadrupled the number of people who are using a computer to do their job not in the workplace, chances are you're not going to issue computers to those. So you're now dealing with, instead of maybe a well-controlled remote user strategy, now you're going to have to develop a bring your own computer strategy. So that's it's the policy, the existence of a policy, the ability to implement that policy on a large scale. And one of the other things which I think are significant is that the security issues need to be communicated to now this army of remote users who potentially never got the training, never got the email. And so, providing them with support, providing them with information as to good practice becomes a significant manpower challenge.
Very insightful, thank you. Okay, so I believe those are the questions we had for the panel discussion. So thank you both for that insight. I think it was really, really helpful. I believe we're going to move on now to the Q&A portion. So we have a couple of questions already, but we'll leave it open. You guys have the Q&A interface here, so please feel free to ask some additional questions. So let me start with the first question that we have here. And so I think this is probably a question for Sandy. Just based on your experience, please advise implementation of separation of duties in a continuous deployment in agile environment. So I think this person is asking the questions saying, currently all the developers have access to production and they're deployed to production directly. How do you control for this?
Yeah, this is where stage gates are really useful and where development automation is going to be important. If you can have stage gates so that once a developer even wants to push something to production or get it ready, there are a number of automated sort of steps that have to be taken, whether that's an evaluation, various scans, various checks, perhaps even a sign off by somebody on the security team or somebody on an operations team, where it's not just that the developer can push it right away, but it goes through some more automated steps that have to be checked off before you get out there. I think that's a pretty critical element. And that ties into what we were talking about before, Rohit, with the need of building all this automation in.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thanks. Okay, so just going to move on to the question. And this is also for you, Sandy. Who is involved in the purchasing decision for security tooling, and who should be?
Two different questions, right, Rohit?
Yeah.
What do I see and what would I like to see? Well,
Right.
I'll tell you. The good news is that, we're getting closer to what I'd like to see. The budget still usually comes with security. It's usually security's budget. Not always. I think there are some cases where we're starting to see some budget come from development. And in the decision making, certainly security is usually the lead there. But there is a danger. If security goes off and buys a tool and gives it to development, your chances of that getting adopted without dev having any input, not so good. Where I have been encouraged is when I get calls from security pros about tooling decisions, and there's somebody from dev also on the phone, where they've been proactive and thoughtful enough to bring dev to the table. And that's really, you need to start, if you're on the security team and you're not engaging dev in that decision making, you absolutely should be. Remember, they're the ones who are going to be using these tools a lot of the time or integrating it with the rest of their tool chain. They're going to have knowledge for you in terms of, which languages, which frameworks, which tools have to be integrated with. All of that's going to come from dev. So they're a really critical element of that whole decision making process.
Great, thanks, Sandy. And I just add to that I think one of the shifts that we're starting to see in the market speaks a little bit to what you said in kind of the utopian state, is that when development thinks about this problem space, it's not just security, right? They're thinking about security, thinking about compliance, legal,
Yep.
All of the non-functional constraints that sort of force them to not focus on building value or immediate value for the customer, but sort of guardrails around it. And I think that the orientation we're starting to see is, how can we first focus on acceleration of time to market? How do we get products out quickly, but do it in a responsible way? And I think that's leading, like we're starting to see, for example, in the DevOps program, not the DevSecOps program, DevOps program, where they're leading the charge evaluating security tooling, for example, across the organization, which is new, right? New trend for us. Okay, this one I'm going to ask Andy. What are some of the major technological shifts that we expect to see in areas like DevOps, agile development, cloud computing, and containers?
So let me start with cloud computing, because I think that out of those four, that's the one that is the biggest area of change and the biggest impact. And I mentioned that earlier, that whether you're using the cloud as a development environment using Amazon Web Services, for example, or whether you're actually using a cloud provided supplier of ready-to-wear software, the shift, the increasing use of the cloud, I think becomes a very important issue for a majority of the CIOs that I've spoken to.
Great, thanks, Andy. Another question, so this is a specific question for our product, SD Elements. So what are some of the advantages of SD Elements versus competitors, and who are those competitors? So great question. Obviously, this could be a pretty long response, so I'm gonna keep it short for the purposes of the webinar. As a balanced development automation solution, what our product is trying to do is automate a number of security risk and compliance proactive processes, do so in a consistent way. There are tools that help with certain point processes. So for example, if you wanted to do threat modeling, there's a series of threat modeling tools. There's a free Microsoft threat modeling tool. There's Threat Modeler as a tool. So there's a number of ones like this that focus exclusively on threat modeling and allow you to for example, draw diagrams to help to understand what the threats might be for a system. There are also purpose-built risk risk assessment and sort of GRC tools that help specifically in the area and context of risk management. There are tools for privacy and privacy impact assessments, privacy by design, et cetera. And I would say, at large, all of these tools have certain strengths. What people tend to adopt our product for is to look at these things holistically. If what you want to do is have a power tool for an expert to be able to do manual processes, it's best to choose one of those, power tools for that particular use case. But if what you're trying to do is automate as much as possible and reduce the number of processes you have to do across the board, then this is really where, our product shines. And that has to do with the number of features in the product, the integrations in the product, the sheer amount of automation and content that's in the product. And like I said, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to talk about here today, but happy to follow up in a conversation for anyone who's interested. Okay, I think we have probably time for one or two more. What do you see as some of the key challenges organizations face to shift to a new methodology? So for example, building security and compliance into the process in the beginning, like cultural mindset, breaking down silos between functional units. And I think this is probably for both of you, Andy and Sandy, to get your perspective on it.
Ladies first.
Well, speaking generally about this, that breaking down silos is one of the traditional large challenges, getting people to be empathetic and speak each other's languages. As I mentioned earlier, Rohit, I've done a lot of research in security champions programs, and one of the things that I see over and over again in terms of the types of people on the security team that are put in place to run those programs, empathy is absolutely critical. So if there's a lack of empathy on various teams, if they're not understanding what's important or how other groups are incentivized or what they're going through, there's going to be a clash. So in general, then, if you apply that to any sort of shift to building security in and changing the methodology, if there is a lack of empathy from the various teams, if they aren't taking the time to understand how different groups are incentivized, what is important to them, how are they trained, what is it they're trying to do, it's just going to explode.
Yeah, fair enough. Andy, what's your perspective there?
I agree with what Sandy is saying, but I think that the best way historically, and this goes back many, many decades in IT, including representatives, responsible individuals from other areas in your project team, in the broader project team, whether you consider it a steering committee or whatever, that's the best way to do it. I will be more empathetic with your issues if they come out in the context of specific aspects of a particular project. So I think if I were a CIO, I would be taking a look at the composition of project teams or governance groups and make sure that there's good integration of different groups at that level.
Very good. Yeah, and I would probably just echo that. I think, our experience has been that the most successful rollouts of these kinds of programs, first of all, treat it like a program and not a person tasked with the problem in isolation, right? Trying to go convince a bunch of people that they should focus on something. It's a program with appropriate executive engagement, but that it's framed from the context, don't want to harp on it, but framed from the context of what's most important to the business. If what's most important to the business is, increasing revenue in the year, decreasing costs, and that's what's driving the priorities for the organization, then, the program should be aligned with that. How will we best do this without causing significant risk? And the challenge is if you go the other way and you just start with a risk reduction as a goal. What we often see is people building really elaborate programs that don't prioritize moving quickly. So for example, doing really laborious exercises, lots of documentation before you can kick off a project, that sort of thing. And it kind of flies in the face of the need to move quickly. So I think that that's a really important thing. It's not just the risk management side of the organization that's driving the agenda, but you're starting first with, what's most important to the business. Okay. Well, I think we've reached the end of this portion. So thank you both to Sandy and Andy. Great insight. Very much enjoyed having you here today. We're gonna just move on to the next section here. Just, I want to thank all the attendees. Like we mentioned, you're going to get a copy of this. A couple things, if you want to learn more about balanced development automation, please go to our website. You can listen to our podcast called The Balancing Act. And by the way, we're looking for speakers for that podcast all the time, people who have some background in balancing the need for building software with the needs of security, compliance, and risk management. So if that's an area of expertise for you, we'd love to be able to talk to you. Okay, so thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance today and look forward to talking more in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.